I'd like to introduce now our second speaker, Janet Fraser. Janet lives on Darug and Gundungera country in the Blue Mountains region. She's a poet, a historian, and national convener of Australian Parents Questioning Gender. She also convenes the Australian Home Birth Network, Joyous Birth, and she co-founded the New South Wales Women's Guild. Janet first spoke at one of our events in Brisbane Meanjin in 2019. COVID prevented her coming back in 2020, but we're very happy to welcome you back this time, Janet, and I'd like everyone to welcome Janet.
Thanks, Anna. Helen is always a hard act to follow. This work was produced, as is all my best work, on the land of the Darug and the Gundungera people, which is the Blue Mountains west of Sydney. As the UK seems finally to be unpacking some of the assumptions and myths about medically altering children's bodies, Australia is still mired in just one dominant permitted view, promoted by corporations, the national broadcaster, and apparently the Education Department of Queensland, but also our federal government. The dominant view that transgender children are a healthy phenomenon with known historical antecedents, only opposed by those who seek to harm children and motivated by right-wing or fundamentalist religious notions, is everywhere. Parents of children who are medically altered without their consent are silenced by the courts and media. Their narrative does not fit the standard of brave, knowing child who speaks a personal and unassailable truth from a place outside of any worldly concerns and without comorbidities or pressure from without. As we see on this panel, let alone the groups set up around the country to support desperate parents, the reality is much less supportive of this set of stories. Since I last spoke here about these issues, the landscape internationally has begun to shift in ways which would be major, were they accurately reported, in a media intent on pushing the profitable narrative of the cute trans kid. Kira Bell, a genuinely brave detransitioned woman, spoke up with the support of academics, therapists, lawyers, women's groups, and the ever-growing ranks of desisters and transitioners, and the story finally broke in the UK that not all was rosy in the world of medical and surgical responses to psychological distress. What should have broken with a deafening crash and a tsunami of ripple effects in Australia is the report by doctors at one of our major paediatric gender clinics, that of Westmead Hospital in Sydney. The fact that only The Australian, in the form of the ever-courageous and laudable Bernard Lane, covered this story, has done children and struggling families in this country a shocking disservice. This report is an appeal for nuance in a sector now overrun by activist physicians and corporatised government support to medicalise children on the flimsiest of excuses. It appears clear that the doctors who authored the report are part of a worldwide phenomenon of people at ground zero where the drugs are dispensed, trying to speak up in an effort to prevent potential harm to vulnerable teens. Tellingly, the authors have listened to detransitioners and seek to incorporate their experiences into a cautious, holistic approach which treats each child as an individual with a story and an environment from which their discomfort and distress have flowed. The authors make it clear that they do not wish to attach themselves to the affirmation-only model, but seek to provide ethical, holistic care to what are significantly troubled children and very often families in crisis. As I've previously observed from my reading of the excellent work of John Whitehall, but so many other Australians now as well, and my own reading of judgments made in the family court for teens seeking access to medical interventions, the issues of male violence and abuse are very much live and a consistent theme for many of these young people. The Westmead authors have observed this closely. As they note themselves, their study is small, being 79 children. However, the Dutch study, used as justification all over the world for this medicalising model, was similar numbers, and the number of children embarking on this path as far as medicalisation does remain relatively small. The authors of the Dutch study have also recently drawn attention to their changed view, but again, we don't hear about this in the Australian media. Of course, we have no real way to measure the medicalising of children, since private endocrinologists have a significant role to play, and there is no way to capture their data via Freedom of Information requests. Last time I spoke at one of the Brisbane Meanjin events, it was in the immediate wake of an Australian story program on the ABC about children who were being described as non-binary. This time, since the propaganda is never ending, I'm speaking in the wake of a hagiography of one of our gender experts, the director of the Royal Children's Hospital Gender Clinic for Adolescents in Melbourne. It is curious to me that the Westmead report and this doctor's reports of her patients are so dissimilar. The Westmead report has much more in common with statements like this one made by Dr. Heather Brunskill-Evans in the Medical Law Review in 2019, who wrote, "Gender identity is the only condition for which a doctor prescribes treatment where there is no test and the diagnosis is self-report, and where the children and young people are physically healthy and phenotypically normal. A large percentage of young people referred for gender dysphoria have a substantial co-occurring history of psychosocial and psychological vulnerability, thus supporting the need for a comprehensive assessment that goes beyond an evaluation of gender dysphoria per se. It is curious how different the reports we have on ABC are from those around the world detransitioning. I've previously detailed these cases in the family court, and how these teenagers seem to be a population with high levels of anxiety, depression, male violence in the home, dysfunctional families of origin, or the occasional child in foster care, and thus the state is in loco parentis. Another significant expert in this field, Dr. Ken Zucker of Toronto, whose career was almost overturned by trans activists, made similar observations also in a 2019 paper. Zucker notes, "Based on a variety of measurement approaches, it has been found that adolescents referred for gender dysphoria have, on average, more behavioural and emotional problems than non-referred adolescents, but are more similar than different when compared with adolescents referred for other mental health concerns." It is important to note the care with which the Westmead report attempts to offer a holistic and honest view of the issues in children they see, as well as the pressures and complications within the team playing a part in how this report has been produced. This is not a wholesale dismissal of children's pain or psychological issues. It is a careful survey of those who consented to form part of the study. Of the 108 children through the service at the time of the study, 79 agreed to be part of it. The majority of those, as we are used to seeing, are girls. So 46 girls and 33 boys. Most were Caucasian at 86%, and I think it important to note that Aboriginal children made up 5% of the total. Other groups were far smaller, comprising 1% of the overall group. It seems clear from reports like this one that trauma is one of the risk factors for an eventual diagnosis of gender dysphoria, going hand in hand as it also does with anxiety, depression, and other mental health concerns. While our reporting is so poor, to me it is not insignificant that the largest single group after white kids is Aboriginal kids. 5% of a population is an interesting statistic for a group which comprises maybe 3% of the Australian population, and another aspect we need to consider closely. Another statistic to note is that 3.8% of the children were living in foster care, another group with notable experiences of trauma. It seems likely that the medical alteration of these children's bodies is being pursued while the parents are not decision makers, which brings to mind the concerns of Canadians who've noted a significant rise in foster children being medically transitioned. Canadian government policy, like Australia, includes the nebulous gender identity in rafts of characteristics in need of legal protection, and so foster children can only be placed with families who support the idea. As advocates I've spoken to have noted, fostered populations are a uniquely at-risk group in need of trauma-informed care. This should give pause for thought to doctors seeing foster children without their parents' consent, who are failing to offer a therapeutically holistic service to these children. The report does not make clear which children may also be Aboriginal and in foster care, a too common experience for Aboriginal children comprising the latest stolen generations. 38% of the children in the Westmead study are in two-parent households and 26% in the household of a single mother. 1.3%, or one child, was in a home with a single father. There are some concerning notes sounded in the report about a large proportion of the families being in crisis, often via domestic or family violence, some affected by immigration, and a distinct group affected by adverse childhood events and bullying. Only one child declared that they had not been affected by adverse childhood events. And one does not suffer significant distress around gender identity. Significantly, the families self-report far differently from the clinical observations, which could be for a number of reasons, including shame, but also potentially a lack of insight into the stressors they manage on a daily basis. It also unsurprisingly indicates that children in this cohort are often managing significant family stressors. The case of Re A, which was heard last year in the Queensland Supreme Court, sheets home a number of these factors. A teenaged boy whose violent father has not been in touch with the mother and child since 2017 was exhibiting great distress about his male body and growth into an adult male. The doctors noted this child's comorbidities, particularly anxiety and depression, that he, whom they persist in calling she throughout, is particularly distressed at the thought of his body changing and becoming that of an adult male. The judgment mentions the father perpetrator having committed significant violence within the home. Surely it isn't too much of a stretch to see a boy identifying that he shares his biology with a violent perpetrator and feeling that he absolutely does not wish to grow into such a person. The court reports that the boy was indicating he wished to be perceived as a girl from around the age of 4, that he chose stereotypically feminine clothing in preference to that of stereotypically masculine clothing. It is a curious phenomenon to me, as a mother of a boy and a girl, to consider that their choice in clothing, the colour of their clothing or their hobbies might indicate to me that there's something other than the sex indicated by their bodies. We also know that since we live in a world where heterosexuality is depicted on every street corner, that when a little boy says he wants to be the princess, not rescue the princess, he's synthesising what he sees around him in relational terms and transposing it into the only models available to him. It isn't that he wants to be a girl, he wants a romantic relationship with the knight, but we've failed to show him knights fall in love with other knights. Obviously, we don't know about this child, but given the international studies consistently show a large proportion of children indicating discomfort or confusion about their sexed bodies grow up to be lesbian, gay or bisexual, it is always worth considering and supporting your future gay child to be who they are without medicalisation. Generally, unless there are significant issues at play, mothers want the best possible outcomes for their children. It discomforts me to see mothers automatically blamed for the medicalised children we see around us. 54% of the Westmead children first disclosed to their mother, 3.8% first disclosed to their father. A lot of what we see in terms of public views in families where a child is being medically transitioned involves mothers because mothers are the frontal lobes for families. They organise the medical and dental appointments, they do the school canteen, they have the primary care and organising for children in the vast majority of heterosexual relationships. It thus falls to mothers to take children to appointments at the gender clinic. While there are complex relationships between trans activism and women, I do not think there is a new group of mothers with some form of Munchausen by proxy who are doing harm to their children for attention. I do think mothers know exactly how much punishment awaits them for being wrong, and I think the suicide narrative exploited by trans activists bears some responsibility in this. It is worth noting Ken Zucker's comment on that in his 2019 paper, where he notes the activist physicians Karasic and Ehrensaft, she of the "if your child takes the hair clip out of their hair, then they must be a boy," asserted that completed suicides are alarmingly high, a statement which, in Zucker's view, has no formal and systematic empirical basis. In fact, he would argue that this statement itself is alarming. The Westmead report raises some really major concerns. It is utterly shocking that the media barely noted its arrival. There are indications the team itself struggles along the fault lines well known to all of us, and the report is a tribute to professionalism. The authors report that there is a significant cohort of children who arrive at the clinic well versed by other people, the internet and activists to believe medical transition is their only and best option. The recent changes in law making medicalization more accessible have led to increased pressure on doctors to immediately provide puberty suppressants and opposite ever before. And the authors say this: from the clinician perspective, we recognise the emergence of this conveyor belt or tick-the-box mentality, a model for treating gender dysphoria stripped bare of holistic bio-psychosocial care, as driven by the misguided belief that affirmation of gender dysphoria equates to a medical intervention pathway. The team notes that their endeavours to explore belief systems and experiences are firmly rejected, and also that they can see children not have the cognitive, psychological or emotional maturity to understand what they're really choosing. As they note, adolescents do not have the capacity to fully understand the value, or otherwise, which fertility may hold for them in the future. This isn't a criticism of youth. It is a simple fact that some of these things unfold for us all over time. Children struggling with complex mental health issues are not necessarily best placed to comprehend these adult endeavours. It is also deeply concerning that within the families themselves, the focus on the child and the trans identity of that child is pursued to the exclusion of holistic therapeutic support of the whole family. As the authors put it, not surprisingly, families tended to medicalise the child's distress, attributing it solely to gender dysphoria as an isolated phenomenon, with the consequence that the family identified pathway providing the only potential way forward. The motivation to engage in individual or family work to explore the broad range of difficulties and psychological, family or loss trauma issues contributing to the clinical picture was generally low. I find it all the more remarkable that ABC TV is then able to present us with such pictures of functional families, loving, supportive parents, and children who only need doctors to provide them with the right body. I find it a curious statement that the subject of the show says of a girl, "I can help you have a boy's body," when there is only one way to have a boy's body, and that is to be born male. It would surprise me to learn that a demographic in the major city of Melbourne and the major city of Sydney would be so different. The report details deep concerns with autistic children, children with depression, and children who've been victims of sexual abuse. As we have all been noting for some years now, this idea that any mental health concerns are related to a lack of acceptance of trans identities and all is alleviated by altering the child's body is deeply entrenched. Families who are resistant to family therapies are also resistant to treating or managing those mental health issues, so children's distress goes unmanaged, even as the authors attempt to help them. A few of the children in the study were even psychotic, and yet, as I've previously noted, children with psychosis are given permission in the family court to access medical interventions. The report makes a mention of family agendas and dysfunction in terms which are familiar to those of us who've read those judgments. There are some parents who both support the notion of gender identity and medicalisation. There are some who do not. As noted, there is a high proportion of children from families where the threat or actuality of violence is manifested. Which brings me back for a final word about A, the boy I mentioned at the start. A, whose doctors insist his perfectly understandable mental health issues, coming from a place of terrible trauma, will go away if they suppress his puberty with daily tablets because he has too great a fear of needles for the usual doses. Whose doctors are ignoring that this boy is so damaged he weeps over the thought of developing a normal male body, and yet are prepared to deny him a future normal, healthy adult relationship where he might enjoy comfort and love. Sensitive therapeutic support could make all the difference to children like A, and we need more brave doctors like the Westmead authors speaking up on behalf of such vulnerable children. Thanks.